The moment the MRI results came back, nobody in the room moved for a few seconds. Not because they didn't understand them, but because they did. And once you understand something like that in a professional baseball environment, you don't rush to speak. You sit with it. You let it settle. Because the truth changes everything, especially when it involves Shohei Ohtani, a player whose presence doesn't just affect a lineup, but the entire emotional structure of a franchise. What was supposed to be a routine medical update quickly turned into a moment that forced everyone inside the organization to rethink not only the next game, but the entire direction of the immediate future. It started with something small. A swing that looked slightly off. A moment of hesitation during contact. Nothing dramatic enough for the crowd to notice, but enough for the training staff to pay attention. In baseball, the smallest details often become the biggest warnings. By the time Ohtani walked off the field that day, there was already quiet concern building inside the Dodgers' medical room. No one said it out loud immediately, but everyone felt it. Something wasn't fully right. And when a player like Ohtani shows even a hint of discomfort, the entire organization treats it differently than anyone else. The MRI was scheduled quickly, almost quietly, as if speed could reduce concern. Inside the facility, there was no panic, just urgency. Staff members moved with controlled efficiency, avoiding unnecessary words. The scan itself didn't take long, but the waiting afterward felt longer than any game. Every minute without information felt heavier, because everyone understood what was at stake. This wasn't just about one game or one series. It was about maintaining stability around a player who has become the center of everything the Dodgers are trying to build. When the results were finally reviewed, the room shifted. Not dramatically. Not with shouting or chaos. But with that subtle drop in energy that experienced professionals recognize immediately. The kind of silence that means the answer is not catastrophic, but it is serious enough to change plans. The hand wasn't structurally damaged in a way that ended a season, but it wasn't perfect either. And in elite baseball, not perfect is enough to force immediate decisions. That information moved quickly up the chain of command until it reached Dave Roberts. And this is where the situation changed from medical concern to leadership crisis. Because Roberts wasn't just receiving a report. He was receiving a responsibility. A decision point that would directly affect not only Ohtani's health management, but also the competitive identity of the team in the short term. The internal discussion that followed was tense but controlled. Some believed Ohtani could continue playing without interruption, adjusting mechanics slightly and managing discomfort. Others argued that any risk, no matter how small, was unacceptable given his value and the long-term stakes of the season. The disagreement wasn't loud, but it was real. And in moments like this, silence between arguments can be more intense than shouting. Roberts eventually made his call. It wasn't announced with drama. There was no press conference energy in the room. It was simply a decision made under pressure. Ohtani's workload would be adjusted immediately, with specific restrictions placed on how he was used until further evaluation. It was the kind of decision that protects the future but creates questions in the present. The kind of decision that always looks clearer in hindsight than it does in the moment. But the reaction inside the organization wasn't unified. Because not everyone agreed with how quickly the adjustment was made. That disagreement reached a breaking point during a closed team discussion later that day, where pitching coach Mark Prior reportedly lost his composure in front of staff and players. The frustration wasn't random. It came from a place of competitive urgency. Prior had spent days preparing game plans built around certain expectations, and suddenly those expectations shifted without much time to recalibrate. The room didn't expect escalation. But it happened anyway. Voices rose. Chairs shifted. The tone of the conversation changed from strategic to emotional. According to those present, Prior's frustration wasn't directed at Ohtani personally, but at the timing and communication of the decision. He questioned how quickly the restriction was implemented and whether the full competitive impact had been properly considered before finalizing it. At one point, the discussion became heated enough that others in the room stopped contributing entirely. When experienced professionals stop talking, it usually means the emotional temperature has exceeded productive levels. And in that moment, the tension wasn't about disagreement anymore. It was about control, responsibility, and the pressure of managing a roster built to win immediately. Robert stepped in to calm the situation, but even his intervention couldn't fully reset the emotional tone. The decision had already been made, and now everyone was dealing with the consequences of it in real time. That is often the part of leadership that fans never see. The decision itself is only the beginning. The aftermath is where the real difficulty lies. Meanwhile, Ohtani himself remained largely removed from the internal chaos. When informed of the MRI results and the adjustment to his usage, his response was minimal. No visible frustration. No public reaction. Just acknowledgement and focus. That reaction, or lack of reaction, only added to his reputation inside the organization. Because while others debated intensity, urgency, and strategy, he remained centered on execution. But even silence has weight in a clubhouse. Teammates noticed the shift immediately. Not in how Ohtani acted, but in how others around him adjusted. Batting order discussions became more cautious. Training sessions were slightly more controlled. Coaches monitored his swings more closely than usual. The entire environment subtly reorganized itself around a single medical update that, in any other context, might have been considered minor. The irony was that Ohtani still looked like himself. He still moved with the same rhythm, the same focus, the same calm presence that makes him feel unaffected by external pressure. But now, every movement was being evaluated through a different lens. Every swing was analyzed not just for performance, but for protection. As the next game approached, the tension inside the organization shifted from diagnosis to application. How do you manage a player who is essential to winning, but also requires protection that limits how he can be used? That question doesn't have a clean answer. It requires constant adjustment, constant communication, and constant trust between player and management. And trust, in moments like this, becomes the most important factor of all. Before the game, Roberts addressed the situation carefully. He avoided specifics, choosing instead to emphasize caution and long-term planning. His tone was measured, but the message was clear. Ohtani would still play a central role, but not under the same unrestricted expectations as before. It was a balancing act between competitiveness and preservation. Inside the clubhouse afterward, reactions were mixed. Some players understood the caution immediately. Others felt the timing could disrupt rhythm. But nobody openly challenged the decision. Because when it involves Ohtani, every opinion carries more weight, and every disagreement feels larger than it is. Then came the most unexpected moment of all. During a quiet stretch of pre-game preparation, a brief exchange reportedly took place between Pryor and Roberts that reignited earlier tension. It wasn't planned. It wasn't public. But it was intense enough that nearby staff immediately noticed the shift in tone. Pryor, still frustrated from earlier discussions, questioned whether the restrictions were limiting competitive advantage too early. Roberts, already under pressure from multiple directions, defended the decision firmly. Voices rose again. Not into chaos, but enough to signal unresolved tension. And then it stopped. Because both understood the same thing in that moment, regardless of disagreement, the decision had already been set in motion. The game would go on. Ohtani would still play. The team would still compete. But something subtle had changed inside the organization. The balance between aggression and caution had shifted, and everyone could feel it. When the game finally began, Ohtani stepped onto the field as he always does, calm and composed. Nothing about his outward presence suggested uncertainty. But internally, the structure around him had changed. Every decision involving him now carried additional weight. Every movement was watched more carefully. Every inning was managed with more awareness than before. And yet, despite everything happening behind the scenes, the most striking part remained unchanged. When Ohtani took his first at-bat, the stadium reacted the same way it always does. Expectation. Silence. Anticipation. Because regardless of MRI results, coaching disagreements, or internal frustration, the reality of baseball remains simple when he steps into the box. Something could happen at any moment. Something only he can create. And that is why, even in the middle of medical uncertainty, managerial pressure, and coaching conflict, the entire stadium still holds its breath the same way every time. Because some players change games. But Shohei Ohtani changes the entire atmosphere before the game even begins.